In September of 2008, in a middle-class neighborhood, authorities were called to a house of horrors. Inside was a scene filled with so many methods of death, it was practically dangerous to walk through. But the most shocking part was who was responsible for it all. This is the case of Susan Bailey. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also accidentally being in the background of random photos. Every time! But anyway, today we're going over the case of a hard-working woman who was betrayed in such a gruesome and terrible manner that it's hard to even talk about. Susan Bailey was born Susan Morton on February 20th of 1965. Her parents' names were Kate and Stephen, and growing up, her and her family lived in a suburb of Minnesota. Overall, Susan was a happy-go-lucky type of kid who made friends easily. She was the second of 4 children and had one older sister and 2 younger brothers. By all accounts, Susan was smart and good at school. She always completed her homework on time and did well on tests. Oh, and speaking of tests, I just want to say thank you to Test 'em All for sponsoring this video. Test 'em All is an application with loyalty rewards for top free mobile games. Basically, the app will reward people with real money payouts just for playing popular mobile games that millions around the world play. It's very easy to get started. All you have to do is download the app, make sure you confirm access to track your game's progress, and boom, you're ready to get going. Now you have to pick out a game that you'd like to play, and just a heads up, some games will have a higher coin reward than others. After you downloaded a new game, Test 'em All will track how you do in the game and reward you dependent on that. This also pertains to the beginning when you created an account and it requested app permissions. Finally, once you gained enough coins to cash out, you can choose from the many options on the Payout tab. There are multiple options to choose from, such as PayPal credit and Amazon gift cards, all the way to great deals from your favorite brands. There are daily and weekly promotions, and you can even follow the app messages to get notified when special offers are happening. Make sure you go to the link in my description to get started with Test 'em All. The street Susan and her family lived on was full of as many as 10 houses, and at the end of the street was a property with horses and cows. This gave it a mix of a rural and suburban feel. According to others, Susan was dependable and hardworking, even as a teen. During the summers, she spent time with her grandparents at their lakeside resort, and here she was able to find a bit of work. Susan did things such as laundry, cooking meals, and cleaning, and in turn, her grandparents gave her some cash. After graduating from high school, she wound up attending a local college in Minnesota, and in order to pay for it, she got a job as a retail clerk. Then during one winter, there was a series of blizzards in the town where she lived. After that, Susan had enough of the harsh winters, and she made the decision to get the heck out of Minnesota. Soon, she booked a flight to Cali, said goodbye to her family, and left Minnesota for good. And as it turned out, this would be a decision that she was very happy about. Unlike cold Minnesota, Susan now found herself underneath sunny skies and near sandy beaches. California was like a dream come true. Within a matter of time, Susan found another job in retail and then met the love of her life, a man by the name of Richard Bailey. Richard was a member of the Air Force and had a very relaxed, California-esque personality. Susan and him got along quite well, and by March of 1988, the pair had gotten married. That's when Susan Morton became Susan Bailey. Apparently, Susan's parents weren't that fond of her new husband, but in the end, it was Susan's decision, and they respected it. For the next several years, Susan and Richard moved around a lot due to Richard's position in the Air Force. During this period, Susan spent long amounts of time home alone while Richard attended to his duties. But eventually, in 1990, Richard left the military altogether, and the Baileys moved back to California. Later that year, the couple finally had their first child, a girl by the name of Jennifer. Then 4 years and 1 day after that, they had their second, a boy by the name of David. Meanwhile, Susan's career in retail clothing blossomed. For a little bit of time, she even became the primary breadwinner of her family, and Richard then became the one who stayed home while Susan worked. The company Susan worked for was called J. Jacobs Retail Clothing, and in 1997, they gave her a position as the district manager for Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. This was a massive pay upgrade and an offer she couldn't turn down. So that year, the Bailey family, including Susan, Richard, and their 2 kids, all relocated to Texas. By 2000, they had officially built their own home in an 8,000-person town called Roanoke. Here, the Baileys lived in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, and their house was 3,400 square feet with 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a game room. Overall, everything in Susan's life was coming together nicely. She had a good marriage, a house, a family. It was like the American dream. But little did she realize that that dream would become a horrible nightmare. In this new neighborhood where the Bailey family lived, Susan made a couple of close friends. Their names were Kim and Cheryl, and each of them had preteen kids who were around the same age as Susan's. Across the street from the Bailey family's house was a park, and whenever the kids were finished playing at the park, they all ended up hanging out at the house. Meanwhile, the parents hung out in the backyard or inside the home. Susan, Kim, and Cheryl were always chatting and keeping up with the latest talk of the neighborhood gossip. But before long, an uncomfortable truth began to emerge about Susan's teenage daughter, Jennifer. Unbeknownst to Susan, Jennifer had begun stealing things from her neighbor, Kim's house. Jennifer oftentimes hung out with Kim's daughter, and whenever she left, Kim would notice objects in her house had gone missing. So eventually, Kim told her daughter to stop inviting Jennifer over. But oddly enough, Kim never actually told Susan herself about her daughter's activities. She apparently thought that Susan had enough on her plate already, that she didn't need to know her daughter was a thief. And this was true to some extent. Susan did have a lot on her plate, and as the years passed, that plate piled up even further. While one of her kids was secretly a thief, the other, David, was a bedwetter. This wasn't his fault, of course, but it was an issue that Susan had to deal with nevertheless. Practically every day she had to wash and clean his bed sheets, and it was a constant source of stress for her. Susan also had to deal with issues regarding David's behavior in middle school. Frequently, he was getting into fights, and this got worse as the years passed. Then, an even more serious issue hit when the company that Susan worked for went bankrupt, leaving her jobless. Luckily, by then, she had developed a side hustle selling cosmetics, but this didn't really make up for the loss of income. Susan found a new job at a plus-size clothing store known as Lane Bryant. This would be her new main job alongside a part-time job at Bed Bath & Beyond. Meanwhile, over time, Susan's marriage to Richard broke down, and in 2006, the pair officially separated. For whatever reason, Richard didn't fight for anything in the divorce settlement, and Susan ended up retaining both custody of the children and most of Richard's material things. So ultimately, Richard moved out of the family's home, but was still forced to pay child support, meaning that Susan essentially became a single mother. And at the same time, Susan's kids, Jennifer and David, became increasingly problematic for her. Susan was now working non-stop in order to pay the bills, and she didn't have the time to pay as much attention to her kids as she would have liked. By 2008, David, who was then in 8th grade, was really slacking off at school and had apparently begun cutting his arms in response to all of the stress he was dealing with at home. Susan was practically never home, and Jennifer was soon complaining about having to, quote-unquote, be David's mom, with the reason being that she had to watch David all the time, like his babysitter. But more than just complaining, Jennifer was about to start doing something far worse: conspiring. Around age 17, Jennifer met a boy at school named Paul Henson. Paul was 16 and a product of a somewhat broken family and really just an unusual person overall. At 6 feet tall and 145 pounds, he was considered tall and lanky and lived in a trailer park. And personality-wise, he suffered from extreme mood swings and even claimed to have 2 personalities, with one being named Paul and the other being named Talos. According to Paul, his Paul side was somewhat normal, while Talos was violent and angry. Sometimes Paul would even make explicit threats of murder and claim it was Talos saying it. Paul said that Talos was the reincarnation of an executioner from the 19th century. Students often reported that Paul was frequently caught speaking in unknown languages and to imaginary people. So yeah, a lot of weird stuff going on. But despite this strange behavior, it was all sort of masked by the fact that Paul loved playing fantasy role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. So even if he was suffering from a mental disorder or something, one could easily credit it to being his imagination. But Jennifer liked Paul and ended up sharing a lot of his interests. She too had been into fantasy and vampires and all that type of stuff. And so before long, she was calling herself a witch and playing into Paul's fantasies. Together, they even did weird things like engaging in witchcraft and wearing dog collars with each other's names written on them. Now, because of Paul's claims that he had another personality, he quickly used that to justify why he wanted to invite another person into their relationship. Soon, the couple brought in another girl named Mary Lee White. Mary Lee was a few years younger than them at age 14 and had come from a wealthy family. She was young and impressionable, and Paul used this to his advantage. Because of Paul's alleged split identity, he explained to Jennifer that while Paul loved her, Talos loved Mary Lee. That way, they were both okay with the setup. And over time, Jennifer and Mary Lee grew to like each other and even became convinced that the 3 of them were all destined to be together, that they had all known each other in past lives. But at the same time as this weird throuple was forming, Jennifer's mother, Susan, was mostly concerned about her daughter's new boyfriend. Susan disliked Paul pretty intensely and found him strange, and Jennifer and Susan were always arguing about her relationship with him. At first, this started off as just an annoyance to Susan, but eventually it was going to result in a target being placed on her back. Susan did as much as humanly possible to get Jennifer to avoid seeing Paul, including banning him from their house and forbidding her from having any contact with him. But Jennifer did so anyway, and on multiple occasions, she even snuck out and spent the night at Paul's before coming back the next morning. Then progressively, it all just got worse and worse. Throughout the middle to the end of the school year in 2008, Susan and Jennifer's relationship deteriorated rapidly. Jennifer was about to graduate from high school, and she had an entire set of goals ahead of her. The main ones were to go to the Art Institute of Dallas and to move out of her mother's house. But in the meantime, Jennifer was still living under her mother's roof and causing trouble. During the week of Jennifer's graduation, Susan's parents, Kate and Stephen Morton, spent the week at the Bailey family's house. At one point, Kate observed the ways in which Jennifer disobeyed Susan. Apparently, the house was constantly a mess, and before work, Susan frequently gave Jennifer orders to clean, but she never did. This led to the carpet being filled with fur from their pets and dishes piling up. On one occasion, Kate heard strange noises coming from Jennifer's bedroom upstairs. In response to this, she went up there, knocked on the door, and nearly caught Jennifer in the act with Paul. In other words, even with her grandmother being directly downstairs, Jennifer was having sex with her boyfriend in the same house. Overall, the tension in the Bailey family home was palpable, and after Jennifer's graduation, Kate was happy to return back home to Minnesota. Following her graduation, Jennifer found a job at a fast food restaurant, and this created a bit of a problem for her mother, Susan. Susan was worried about David being forced to stay home alone too much, and so she asked her parents in Minnesota if they would allow David to come live with them for the month of July. Susan's mother, Kate, agreed, and apparently David adjusted reasonably well, and he learned a lot from his grandparents about doing chores and outdoor activities like fishing. But according to Kate, there were some warning signs regarding David. One example is when Kate went on a trip to a nearby town and brought David with her in the car. During the drive there, David essentially demanded that his grandmother buy him a snorkel at the store, but she refused. Then on the way home, David threw such a violent hissy fit that she had to stop the car. It was literally to the point that the car was shaking. So Kate reportedly said to David, "You need to respect your elders." To which he loudly replied, "What about you respecting me?" But practically as soon as they got back to the house, David calmed down like nothing had ever happened. And it was at that moment that Kate realized her daughter had raised a kid with severe emotional problems. Nevertheless, Kate continued looking after her grandson for even longer than expected. The reason for this was because in the final weeks of his stay, David developed a series of lingering staph infections. It's unclear what these were caused by, but due to the severity of them, Kate preferred David to stay with her for a little while longer. Kate did not trust her daughter to be able to properly get David the medical attention he needed. Before long, though, Susan called up Katie and insisted that David be sent back home. Despite her hesitation, Kate agreed, and with the use of a plane ticket Susan bought, David was finally sent back home. Upon David's return home, Susan surprised him and Jennifer with some celebratory gifts. For each of them, she got smartphones with data plans. Susan also planned to buy both her and Jennifer vehicles, but then she realized that she just didn't have the money. So instead, she told Jennifer that Jennifer could have her old car while she got a new one. But Jennifer wasn't exactly satisfied with that idea. She wanted a brand new car, not a dumpy old used one. And although Jennifer was happy about her new cell phone, she quickly found a way to turn that into an argument as well. Before long, the phone bill came in for their family plan, and it was a whopping $1,500, way more than Susan expected. As it turned out, Jennifer had been using all of their free minutes while on the phone with Paul, and David was on the internet on his phone too much. Soon after this, Susan got yet another notice that Jennifer's bank account had been overdrawn by $200. When Susan confronted Jennifer about the issue, Jennifer reportedly said, "I can explain. My paycheck is late and I didn't know it was going to be. I can get the money in the bank as soon as I get my check from my job." But there was only one problem with this, and that was the fact that Jennifer was lying. Soon, Susan went up to the fast food restaurant that Jennifer worked at and figured out that Jennifer hadn't shown up for work in 6 weeks, meaning that the paycheck she promised was never going to happen. Then, to make matters even worse, One day while Susan was at work, she received a strange, unexpected phone call from the police. According to the officer, neighbors had complained that her son David was running around fully in their front yard. At this point, Susan felt like she had lost full control of her family. Jennifer and David were embarrassing her and disobeying her at every turn. And if you can't tell already, both had completely devolved into spoiled brats. Susan worked as much as physically possible for her children, and look at how they repaid her. But as for how this all led to an evil murder plot, well, let's talk about that. So towards the end of the month of September in 2008, Jennifer had begun taking full advantage of the fact that her mother wasn't home a lot. Without Susan's knowledge, Jennifer had allowed both Paul and Mary Lee to move into the house. Like we talked about earlier, the Bailey's house was pretty big, so Jennifer had Paul and Mary Lee stay in one of the guest rooms. Meanwhile, Susan had absolutely no clue about any of this. Paul and Mary Lee had each ran away from their own homes, and whenever Susan returned back to the house, the two of them would hide until she left again. Which, by the way, can you imagine someone secretly living in your house? That would be insane. Anyway, during their stay at the Bailey's house, Paul and Mary Lee roamed around the house, ate the family's food, played fantasy games, and had... David knew about all of this, but he never said a word to his mother about it. And although it was a completely dishonest betrayal of her trust, he apparently just didn't care. But at some point throughout this period, a really dark and evil plan began to emerge. Jennifer, Paul, Mary Lee, and even David had all grown tired of their parents. Mary Lee's mother didn't want her to be with Paul, Paul's father didn't want him to be with Jennifer, and of course Susan didn't want Jennifer to be with Paul. So the only solution to them was to get rid of all of their parents. And because they had to start somewhere, Susan became the main target. As far as the kids were concerned, Susan offered the most resistance out of all of the parents. Not only did Susan argue constantly with Jennifer, but on several occasions, she even threatened to send Jennifer to Minnesota to live with her grandparents. To Jennifer, Paul, and Mary Lee, that sounded almost like a death sentence. And it wasn't just an idle threat. She had already sent David there for a month. So with this being the case, the three of them, along with David, needed to devise a way to get rid of Susan. Together, they came up with a few different methods. One was to crush up a bunch of prescription medication and put it in her pudding. Another was to electrocute her in the bathtub. And yet another was to hit her over the head with a wooden baseball bat. But what they actually did, we'll talk about shortly. As for the other parents, well, for Paul's dad, they planned to shoot him with a gun. And for Mary Lee's mother, Mary Lee would stab her in her sleep. Whichever way it all happened, the final part of the plan involved the whole group driving in a getaway vehicle to Canada. But as the saying goes, the best laid plans often go awry. By Monday, September 22nd of 2008, 14-year-old Mary Lee White had already been missing from her home for a few days. Before long, her mother, whose name was Amy, officially filed a missing persons report and began putting up flyers all around town. During the course of her search for Mary Lee, Amy drove near the Bailey family home and found her daughter walking by herself near the outskirts of the neighborhood. Right away, Amy drove up to Mary Lee, rolled down the window, and demanded that she get in the car. Mary Lee resisted with a vigor and refused, but eventually Amy managed to force her daughter inside of the vehicle. On the way back home, Mary Lee continued to act so erratically that once her and her mom arrived back at their house in Fort Worth, Amy was forced to call the police on her own daughter. When the police arrived, the officer pulled Mary Lee aside and brought her into the passenger side of his police car to talk to her. During her talk with the officer, Mary Lee began crying incessantly, but part of their exchange was quite revealing. According to the officer, at one point he asked why she was so depressed, and Mary Lee replied, "Because there is nothing anyone can do once things get started." The officer found this statement odd and asked Mary Lee to explain what she meant. In response, Mary Lee essentially repeated what she was saying. There is nothing anyone can do. If things start, they are going to happen. Now, once again, the officer tried to get her to clarify the meaning of her statement and added that if she allowed him to help her, he would. To which Mary Lee said, "There is nothing you or anyone can do to help me." Upon further discussion, Mary Lee revealed that Paul, her boyfriend, aka Paul Henson, had just broken up with her. So this was the real reason why she was so upset. But once Mary Lee and the officer were done speaking, he brought her back into her house and attempted to get her to speak with her mother in order to reconcile things between them. Mary Lee refused to talk to her mother, but the police officer was able to get her to agree not to run away from home again. Additionally, her mother Amy chose not to file charges against her daughter for running away. So once the major issues had been resolved, Mary Lee appeared to calm down, and the police officer left the home. The next day, however, on Tuesday, September 23rd of 2008, Amy was about to encounter a chilling surprise. That morning, Amy let her daughter stay home from school, and then she informed her she herself planned to stay home as well. That way they could work together to mend their relationship. Shortly after telling her daughter this, Amy went upstairs and went back to bed for a while. But only hours later, she suddenly awoke to find Mary Lee hovering over her bed with a kitchen knife. Immediately, Amy jumped out of bed and got into defense mode. Then she pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. For the next several minutes, Amy and her daughter were in a bit of a standoff. Mary Lee demanded that her mother give her her car keys so that way she could drive to the Bailey house and follow along with her friends during their escape to the Canadian border. But once police arrived, they took Mary Lee, put her in the back of the police car, and drove her to a juvenile detention center. While there, Mary Lee continued to spill the beans about the deadly plan her and her friends/lovers had come up with. While speaking with the detective, Mary Lee was quoted as saying, "The plan is in motion for them to get a car and go to Canada." And if this was true, the plan had begun, but it was already experiencing some setbacks. Only one day before this, Paul Henson had tried and failed to initiate his part of the plan. He was, of course, going to attempt to murder his own father, whose name, by the way, was also Paul. Paul Jr. waited until his father and stepmother left their trailer home to go to work for the day. After that, he grabbed his father's Ruger .22 caliber handgun and waited for them to return home. But at the last minute, his parents took a detour to watch a movie and grab dinner. So when they ultimately took way longer than expected to return home, Paul got cold feet and decided to take a cab back to Jennifer's house in Roanoke. The following day, on Tuesday, September 23rd, Paul's father decided to report him missing, and a police investigation began into Paul's whereabouts. As it happens, this was the same day Mary Lee was sent to juvenile detention. But despite all these strange things Mary Lee said about a plan being in motion, word would not get around to the proper authorities until the next day. Nevertheless, back at the Bailey's family's house on Tuesday, things were heating up. 13-year-old David had gone to school that morning and brought a large knife with him. Once the school administrators found out about it, they gave him a 3-day suspension. In response, Susan posted the suspension document on the fridge using a magnet, and that was that. She was too busy to deal with it at that point. The next day, on Wednesday, September 24th, a veteran detective by the name of Don Britt showed up at the Bailey family's house and rang the doorbell. Detective Britt was from the Denton County Sheriff's Office. Denton County was, of course, where Roanoke was located in, and also where Paul Henson and his family lived. But they lived further to the outskirts of the county compared to the Baileys. So after Detective Britt rang the doorbell, Susan Bailey answered and told the officer that not only was Paul Henson not at her house, but that if he was at her house, she would definitely know about him being there. She also explicitly said Paul wasn't allowed there. But Detective Britt suggested to Susan that maybe it was possible because of her frequent work schedule that Paul snuck into her house when she wasn't home. In response, Susan told the detective that she found that to be practically impossible, that there was no way he could get by undetected. So next, Detective Britt requested to come inside and speak with Susan's daughter, Jennifer. Susan complied, and shortly after Britt walked into the home, Jennifer came down the steps and began to speak with him. Right away, Detective Britt noticed Jennifer was acting a bit stiff when he began to speak to her. Then he asked, "I'm looking for Paul Henson. He's been reported as a runaway, and his father thinks you might know where he is." To which Jennifer responded, "I don't know. I haven't seen him since Saturday." Afterwards, Detective Britt requested to speak with Jennifer alone for a while, but Susan wouldn't allow it. At this point, Britt was sort of in a bit of a pickle. His gut instinct told him that Paul was likely hiding somewhere in the house, but realistically, he wasn't going to be able to extract any more information from Jennifer, nor would he be able to search their house without their consent. So eventually he said goodbye and left the home without any good answers. Later that day, around 7 p.m. in the evening, local police in Roanoke finally got around to searching for Paul Henson. Their first stop was, of course, the Baileys. So at 7:15, Susan yet again received a knock on the door from a police officer. This time it was Officer Alan Moody from the Roanoke Police Department. Alongside Officer Moody were two other officers, and Officer Moody explained to Susan that his main concern was not only Paul's whereabouts, but the possibility that Paul was carrying a gun with him. According to the police report Paul's father filed, a Ruger handgun from his house was missing. Now this was obviously a very dangerous threat. And so although Susan was pretty mad about the whole ordeal, with her consent, the authorities began a search of the home. Upon doing so, police discovered a series of strange findings. One of these was a large butcher knife hidden underneath a couch cushion in the living room. This finding made Susan begin to question things. She started to wonder whether or not the strange tasting pudding that her daughter gave her to eat earlier that day was actually poisoned. Quickly, Susan confronted Jennifer about that, but Jennifer denied the accusation, claiming that the milk in the pudding had probably just gone bad. But in addition to the knife, the cops also found a bunch of luggage belonging to Paul in Jennifer's room, along with his wallet, ID, a pair of his shoes, and a note from Jennifer. When the officers alerted Susan of these findings, Susan reprimanded Jennifer and shouted, "So you and Paul were going to run off again? I have half a mind to ship you off to your grandmother. You can go to the North Woods and play with the raccoons and the bears." Jennifer's argument for Paul's stuff being at the house, but not he himself, was that he had dropped his belongings off that Saturday. Other than that, she claimed to have not seen Paul since then. Jennifer also told the officers that she wasn't aware of any gun or anything of that sort. But Officer Moody wasn't buying it. While talking to Jennifer, he stated, "We know you are lying. If he has that gun and something bad happens, it's going to be on your conscience." In response, Jennifer continued to play dumb and still claimed she didn't have any knowledge of any gun. Then from over Officer Moody's shoulder, Susan once again shouted at Jennifer, saying, "I told you he was bad news. You have 3 choices. You can go to California to your other grandparents, or you can go to Minnesota, or you can go to live with your dad." Soon after this, the officers opened up and searched the suitcases in Jennifer's room and found more unusual items. The one that belonged to Jennifer contained a bunch of her clothes, but the one that belonged to Paul contained both his clothes and a bunch of Susan's DVDs and books. and even more alarmingly, as many as 4 knives. So Susan now knew that not only was there something strange going on with all of the knives, but that her daughter was stealing from her. Soon, police officers seized the knives, but after searching the house and not finding a gun, they left and went out to search for Paul again. Back at the house, Susan decided to call up Paul's father and have him come pick up his son's belongings. Shortly after Paul's father arrived, Susan began rummaging through the suitcases and clothes a bit more and made a shocking discovery that police missed. Deep inside of one of the suitcases was a loaded magazine and a box of cartridges. Immediately after finding this, Susan called the police and told them to come back over and search the house again. However, upon doing their second, more thorough sweep, the police still didn't find a gun. What they did discover, though, was yet another knife under Jennifer's bed and a prescription bottle of antidepressants belonging to Mary Lee White. At the time, the authorities didn't even have Mary Lee White on their radar, though, so they sort of ignored the importance of that. And after still being unable to find a gun, the police left yet again. Paul's father also left and took his son's stuff with him. Now, as for where Paul actually was by then, well, around the time the officers arrived, he had managed to slip out the back door. From that point, he then rushed over to the park located across the street, and he hid there until the police left. Needless to say, that Wednesday night was a very tense one in the Bailey household. Susan had an uneasy feeling about her children, and that feeling was more than justified. After all, the following day was going to be the end of an entire family. When Susan Bailey woke up on the morning of Thursday, September 25th of 2008, she got ready and then hopped in her car to go to work. The first place Susan went was her job at the retail clothing store, and the second was her job at Bed Bath & Beyond. By the time her shift at Bed Bath & Beyond was over, it was nearly midnight. For some reason, Susan had issues getting into contact with her kids the entire day. She had called each of their phones multiple times, but was unable to get through at any point. Because of this, Susan had a feeling of dread and concern during her whole day at work. And unfortunately, that feeling was only going to get worse. Before long, Susan hopped into her car and began the drive back home to Roanoke. Upon arriving at her house, she then pulled into the open garage, sat there for a second, and got out of her car. The first thing Susan then noticed after entering her house through the inner garage door was that all of the lights were off in the home. This was a bit strange considering she explicitly told her children to make sure they were awake once she got back. But hey, maybe they just forgot. But while walking through the first floor, Susan observed an eerie silence. She turned on the light in the living room, and as usual, the house was a bit of a mess. There was some milk left out on the counter, clothes draped over the chairs, and a mountain of paperwork for a project she was working on. Despite her incessantly urging her kids to clean, they always refused to do so. So that part wasn't a surprise. But as Susan slowly began making her way up the steps to her second-floor bedroom, the eerie silence continued. After she reached the top of the steps and started to enter the hallway, she suddenly felt an arm grab her neck from behind her body. Next, she found her mouth being covered with some type of cloth that smelled like chemicals. Then, in the heat of the moment, she saw her children surrounding her. For whatever reason, they were both wearing handkerchiefs over their faces. But upon seeing Jennifer, Susan screamed out to her, "Jennifer, call the police!" Meanwhile, Jennifer just stood there, and one of the last things Susan saw before she felt Paul's knife slit her throat was her daughter shaking her head and saying no. From that point, both of her kids and her daughter's boyfriend then began stabbing her from every angle. And within a matter of time, Susan Bailey was lying dead on the floor. A human life was taken all too soon. But as far as her kids were concerned, Susan's death was only step one. Once the first part of their devious plan was finished, the next phase was about to begin. On Friday, September 26th of 2008, Susan's mother, Kate, received multiple phone calls that morning asking her if she knew where her daughter was. One was from Susan's coworker at Bath and Body Works. According to Susan's coworker, she hadn't shown up for work that morning. Now, this really wasn't like Susan. Susan was a workaholic who always showed up on time. Soon, Kate called her daughter's phone herself, but still nobody answered, so she left a message. Afterwards, she tried calling David's phone, but he didn't pick up either. So then Kate called Susan's phone again, and still, no one picked up on the other end. By this point, Kate started to become extremely concerned. It wasn't like Susan to not show up for work, and it really wasn't like her to not pick up the telephone. Eventually, after so many failed attempts to get into contact with her daughter, Kate called the Roanoke police to ask for a welfare check at her daughter's home. Throughout the next day and a half, the police conducted multiple welfare checks at the house, but they never saw any sign of activity. The lights were off in the home, Susan's car wasn't in the driveway, and there was no detectable movement anywhere. Additionally, an officer was sent to David's school and Jennifer's work, and neither David nor Jennifer were at either locations. Some of the police wondered whether or not the family had gone on vacation, but Susan's mother, Kate, was more inclined to think something terrible had happened. And within a couple of days, a traffic stop in an entirely different state would prove her feelings correct. On Sunday, the 28th, at 3:30 a.m. in the morning, Officer Kolda of the Yankton, South Dakota Police Department, noticed a suspicious vehicle. The vehicle, a blue 2002 Saturn, was parked in front of a closed gas station. Officer Kolda saw a teenager get out of the car, and upon turning on his headlights, he spotted what appeared to be young kids and a dog in the back seat. Soon the teen got back into the car and drove away, and Officer Kolda followed them in his police cruiser. While following the car for several feet, he noticed the license plate was from Texas. On top of this, Yankton had a set curfew for teenagers. So all in all, it became obvious something strange was going on here. After about 40 feet of following the car, Officer Kolda turned on his sirens and had the vehicle pull over to the side of the road. When Officer Kolda walked up to the driver's side door, he looked through the windows of the car and saw the male teenager from before in the driver's seat, a teen girl in the passenger seat, and a young boy and a dog in the back seat. At this point, Kolda knew his eyes weren't deceiving him. So next he asked for the teenager's driver's license and registration, but the driver was only able to provide him with a learner's permit. And that's because the driver was 16-year-old Paul Henson, and Paul didn't have a driver's license yet. After Paul was unable to provide Officer Kolda with the proper identification, Kolda had him step out of the vehicle and make his way to his police car. Once Kolda had placed Paul in the back of his police car, the officer immediately called for backup. Kolda had a feeling that the entire situation was a bit sketchy. When he ran Paul's name through the database, he figured out that Paul had been reported as a runaway and that he was suspected of being in possession of a handgun. He also learned that the vehicle Paul was driving was apparently stolen and had belonged to a 43-year-old woman named Susan Bailey. Within minutes, 2 more officers arrived, and they searched the car looking for a gun, but didn't find one. So next, they had each of the occupants of the car hop into a separate police vehicle. That way, one police officer could speak to each of them. Officer Kolda had Paul get out of his car and hop into a different officer's patrol car. Kolda then replaced Paul with Jennifer, who was of course the teen girl that had been sitting in the passenger side of the stolen car. During his talk with Jennifer, Officer Kolda described her as looking tired and nervous. Jennifer gave Officer Kolda multiple conflicting pieces of information. First, she suggested that her mother had sent her to go live with her grandparents in Minnesota. Then, she suggested that her mother actually didn't know they took the car, and then she said something about how her mother had a vengeful ex-boyfriend. But Officer Kolda wasn't buying any of it. He asked Jennifer for her mom's phone number and tried to call Susan multiple times throughout their talk. However, none of the times he called did he get an answer. Because as we already know, Susan had been dead for nearly 3 days at that point. But before long, Officer Kolda finished talking to Jennifer, and then he and the other officers brought all 3 kids with them back to the station. So ultimately, the second phase of their plan was a bust. Paul, Jennifer, and David were now all locked up and in detention. While at the station, Kolda made a call to the Roanoke Police Department back in Texas. The person that answered was a man by the name of Sergeant George Wise. When Officer Kolda relayed to Sergeant Wise the absurd story that Jennifer told him, Wise found it suspicious. Wise was aware of the situation with the Bailey kids and Paul Henson, and he knew that there were suspicions that Paul had secretly been living with them without Susan's knowledge. So after getting off the phone with Officer Kolda, Sergeant Wise made the decision to head back up to the Bailey house in Roanoke with a couple of officers. Once they got there, Wise determined that there was enough probable cause to enter the home. And when police finally went in, it was a complete and utter nightmare. The first thing the officers encountered was a horrible stench like no other. It smelled like rotting flesh. With their weapons out, police searched the first floor but didn't find anything except for a bowl of pudding that had been left out on the counter. But then, upon making their way up the steps to the second floor, that's when they encountered the source of the smell. Susan's body was lying face down at the beginning of the second floor hallway, and blood was everywhere. On the carpet, the walls, and the doors. Susan was found to have 26 stab wounds and multiple beatings from a baseball bat. Then, as the authorities made their way further into the hallway, they checked out the bathroom. Here they found an entire tub filled with water, along with an orange electrical cord that was hanging from the shower curtain. The whole thing looked like a deliberately made trap. Apparently, there had also been somewhat of an effort to clean up the crime scene. Most of the house smelled like bleach, and there were cell phones and a knife in the bathtub. Additionally, police uncovered surveillance footage of 13-year-old David driving his bike to Walmart to buy the cleaning supplies. Overall, the inside of the home was a house of horrors. Not long after police stepped inside, word was sent out to the police department in Yankton, South Dakota. And for a short time, all 3 of the kids were held at the jail there before being transferred. But justice was coming for Susan. Over the next few years, trials would take place, and in the end, all 3 kids were given lengthy sentences. Jennifer and Paul each received 60 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2038, while David received 26 years in prison and will be eligible for release in 2034. As for Mary Lee White, the other member of the group, well, after providing the Denton County Police with a lengthy, detailed interview, they chose not to file any charges against her. She still had to deal with charges against her mother, however. But after this whole ordeal, her and her mother packed their bags and moved to an entirely different city. Her real name is not actually Mary Lee White, that's just a pseudonym. Now, fortunately, the memory of Susan Bailey will never be forgotten. Susan was as good of a mother and a human being as it gets. She worked tirelessly for her family, day in and day out, and she hardly ever even got as much as a vacation. She was the type of person that made the world a little better, more functional place to live. But in the end, she was repaid for her hard work in the worst way possible, and quite literally backstabbed by those closest to her. Nobody should ever have to experience such a heartless betrayal at the hands of their own family. I'm terribly sorry that this ever happened. Rest in peace to Susan Bailey. And if you're wondering what happened to the dog that was in the car when the kids were all pulled over, well, according to the source I used, it was sent to a shelter after they were all arrested. Sadly, I don't know anything other than that. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the third one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the second one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.